All right.
Close to 2.
Thank you. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited by this opportunity. My name is Karen Tamas. I'm a Senior Program Associate at the Vera Institute of Justice in the Center on Sentencing and Corrections. The Vera Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with offices in New York City, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and Los Angeles that combines research, demonstration projects, and technical assistance to help leaders in government and civil society improve justice systems. For 53 years, Vera has worked with government partners to solve the pressing problems that governments at all levels confront, particularly those in the justice system. I'll be reviewing a few key points about the concept of reentry, which I think follows nicely from the presentations of my colleagues on the panel. And reentry, again, is how to transition offenders out of custody so that they become productive members of our society. And please let me know if you want to discuss any of this research or data in more detail. I'd be happy to speak with anyone at a later date. 1 year after we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, it's stunning that an African-American baby boy born in 2001 has a 1 in 3 chance of spending time in jail in his lifetime. A Latino baby boy, a 1 in 6 chance. With realignment, California joined a movement across the country of states and counties rolling back our relentless push toward mass incarceration and taking another look at expensive and ineffective policies and practices that have helped push states toward insolvency and done little to make our streets safer. Increasingly, rather than relying on incarceration as the sole means for dealing with people who commit crime, we have a whole toolkit of options at our disposal. For example, as my colleagues have both mentioned, we know that providing treatment as an alternative to incarceration for people who are mentally ill or who have an underlying substance abuse problem can help break the cycle of recidivism. And Miami, just to note, Miami-Dade County is one place to look for innovative practices in policing and diversion for this population. But for those who do end up in our prisons and jails, we need to do a better job of preparing them for release. Findings that recidivism rates in the states between 1994 and 2007 ranged from 23 to 60%, with a national average of 44%, forced policymakers in the states and in Congress to revisit the lack of success that our justice system was having on deterring people from crime and to focus instead on doing a better job of preparing inmates for release and assisting those on probation and parole to live crime-free in the community. Prior to SB 678's passage in 2009, California led the nation with revocations at 70% of prison admissions. Probably the single most important key and hope for change in California and elsewhere is a growing recognition on the part of many stakeholders in the system that the mission of the criminal justice system is no longer to catch and punish lawbreakers, but rather to use our growing knowledge of human behavior to focus on producing more public safety and fewer victims in policing, in prosecution, the court, and corrections. The expectation should be, and is in many quarters, that we know enough and are learning more every day to prevent more crime than we currently do, and that we should view most who come in contact with the system as mutable and capable of change. That requires asking change of the system as well as change of offenders. The research has shown and continues to show that giving offenders the tools to cope with re-entering society lowers recidivism rates and lowers the costs to the state in the long run. California and other states are starting to realize this, and there is significant, exciting work happening in this area, but much more could and should be done. I'll review some of the challenges and opportunities of reentry, evidence-based principles and their implications for reentry practice, and I'll try to give you some examples of evidence-based and promising programs that incorporate these principles. A focus on reentry services, we know, is one area that's showing significant promise in reducing recidivism. In 2011, approximately 1,885 individuals a day were released from state or federal custody across the nation. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 4.8 million offenders were under community supervision by the end of 2011. Many of those entering jail and prison have problems related to unemployment, homelessness, substance use, untreated mental illness, and complex medical needs. I'd like to share a few quotes from men that we interviewed in the Los Angeles County Jail that illustrate some of the challenges people face when returning to their communities. A job program would be real cool. They throw a wolf in the middle of the desert with no meat, and we're hungry. That's why we keep coming back. There's no work. If you don't have housing, you don't have anything. Trouble comes knocking. When you have housing, you can lay down anytime. That's the key thing. If you're not rested, bathed, and fed, you don't stand a chance to do anything or participate in any programs. Without receiving support to address these underlying problems while in custody or in the community upon release, large numbers of people we know become caught in the cycle of arrest and reincarceration. Recognizing this costly, damaging pattern, prisons and jails around the country are developing reentry services, such as education, mental health treatment, employment programs, or substance use treatment, to address the problems that lead people into the justice system in the first place. Ideal reentry services start on day one of custody and comprise a continuum of assessment, case management, programming that's responsive to individual needs, in-reach services where community providers and supervision agencies start working with offenders before release, and a seamless transition to treatment and supportive services in the community upon release. Unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but rather a series of approaches that work when tailored to individual circumstances. And while the ideal is to provide services to everyone, most correctional agencies have neither the resources required to serve everyone who comes through their front door, nor the means to target existing resources toward those who are at greatest risk of reoffending. We know that's certainly true in Los Angeles, and it's true in most other jurisdictions, even if they're much smaller. Correctional officials need a way to identify the people in their custody who are at greatest risk of reoffending and are therefore most in need of help to overcome the challenges that led them to jail in the first place. One significant and positive recent shift in correctional policy is the implementation of evidence-based practices, a key intent of California's realignment legislation. Research over the past 2 decades demonstrates that significant reductions in recidivism are possible if current knowledge, or what we're now calling evidence-based practice, is applied correctly. The question about what works in changing offender behavior has been answered. The challenge now is in actually doing it. So some of the basic principles Assistant Sheriff McDonald mentioned, the main one is risk-need responsivity theory. And it was developed in the early 80s, but we're still working out some of the concepts today. In order to maximize the impact of services, these principles must be incorporated in the development of all service plans. The risk principle about the who to target. We know that the most intensive correctional treatment and services should be targeted to high-risk offenders, meaning those who are more likely to reoffend. The need principle is the what to target. Programs should target the individual's criminogenic or crime-producing needs. And this was a good example that Assistant Sheriff McDonald mentioned about the drug treatment. So providing only drug treatment to someone who's a drug user but whose underlying problem is perhaps an untreated mental illness would be a waste of resources. So would putting a drug dealer in a program that's meant for people who have a substance use problem. The third principle, again, responsivity, directs providers to use the method, type, and intensity of treatment most likely to work with specific groups of offenders. And this is the how to target offenders' needs. Overall, we know that there are certain approaches that work best. Usually it's something called a cognitive behavioral approach, which teaches offenders how to change their thought patterns and their actions and gives them a place to practice that. There is no specific reentry model that every jurisdiction can incorporate. Rather, reentry services that reduce recidivism and enhance public safety are all based on these research principles. And I'll describe several elements of those that dictate research-based reentry practice. First, correctional agencies must use objective, empirically based assessments to determine which offenders are at medium and high risk of reoffending. We often equate risk level with the severity of the current offense, the reason why people are in custody to begin with. But the risk of reoffending is far more tied to other personal factors that make a person more or less likely to reoffend. Second, and perhaps most critically, reentry services should be targeted to those medium and high-risk offenders. Low-risk offenders are unlikely to benefit and actually have been shown to be harmed from correctional interventions designed to change their behavior. At the other end, extremely high-risk offenders may not be ready or may not be amenable to change and probably cannot be served with the intensity of dosage and the length of services that are required. It is essential for agencies to find the sweet spot, the right target of offenders who are high risk, high need, and high opportunity. And the current approach in many jurisdictions of targeting low risk or honor dorm offenders is antithetical to principles of risk-informed programming. Agencies need to be able to use data to make informed decisions about how they use their very scarce resources. And I understand also that jurisdictions are wary of the resources required to implement and conduct validated risk and needs assessments on their populations due to time and cost. We know that comprehensive risk assessments can take 45 minutes or an hour to complete, and staff must receive rigorous training to be able to do them accurately. There are some abridged versions, but those don't give you as much information as you might need. We calculated that in New York City, which admits about 230 people every day, it would require 25 to 30 full-time dedicated staff to administer the full COMPASS or LSIR, those are both risk assessments, with everyone. In Los Angeles, the entire reentry team, the Community Transition Unit, could probably be kept busy just doing risk assessments. Our response, however, is that if you don't know anything about risk and needs, implementing programming is a waste of time and money. There are ways to identify the target population more broadly. For example, you can focus assessment resources on frequent flyers or frequent recidivists, people who have an existing case manager in the facility, like a Department of Mental Health clinician, people who stay for a longer time, more than a few weeks, and people identified using a risk screening tool rather than a full assessment. For example, we developed in New York City a service priority indicator tool with the New York City Department of Correction that uses data available from booking to determine who are good candidates to target for full assessment and service. In San Luis Obispo County, we're currently working with the Sheriff's Office to help them implement evidence-based programming by recommending the use of data systems to be able to examine who is in the jail, what their needs are, and to then develop programming responsive to those needs. Several jurisdictions have developed comprehensive assessment, case management, and reentry systems based on data that are working to improve reentry. States like Kansas, Oregon, and Connecticut administer full risk and need assessment tools that are used to work with inmates to develop case plans and programming while they're in custody, and those then serve as the basis for release decisions, reentry planning, and post-release supervision conditions. Next, a risk-based approach demands that services and programs be targeted to address individual offenders' criminogenic needs. Again, needs that are associated with continued offending, such as antisocial thinking and attitudes, lack of pro-social leisure activities, lack of family support, high rates of unemployment, lack of educational achievement, and substance use treatment needs. We know that the more needs that are targeted, the lower the rate of recidivism. It is also critical to match interventions to the characteristics of individual offenders, taking into account things like mental health condition, cultural background, gender, and intelligence level to be able to deliver effective programs. Jurisdictions have implemented reentry practices that do target specific criminogenic needs based on this research across the country, some of which have been evaluated and others that we know are promising. VERA has a substantial body of work on reentry around the country, including the Federal Justice Reinvestment Initiative. JRI and the Federal Second Chance Act also provide examples of proven and promising reentry practices that incorporate the research principles that I've discussed. Here are some examples of things that are working. First, peer mentoring and service engagement. From research that we did in Los Angeles with the Sheriff's Department to map the needs of the jail population and to identify barriers to accessing reentry services, we found that the most common challenges people expected to face upon release were employment, housing, and substance use. However, trust issues and lack of engagement in services were additional barriers preventing people from actually accessing those services. Carefully planned and monitored peer mentoring is a successful component of some of the Sheriff's Department's programs, and research has shown that peer mentoring programs are not only beneficial to clients, but to the mentors and service organizations as well. Second, jail or prison in-reach. Pioneered in Michigan's prisons and in the Los Angeles County jails, in-reach programs are strategies in which community-based service providers and supervision agencies begin working with clients while they're still in custody. In the LA County Jail, we're working with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, the Sheriff's Department, and community housing, substance use, and mental health providers on the Just in Reach program, which is designed to engage people who are chronically homeless and frequent recidivists with services and supports in the jail, and then to transition them directly to permanent supportive housing upon release. And the offenders who are in those programs will already know the service providers that they're going to be working with out in the community, having begun those relationships while they're in custody. We plan to conduct a 2-year evaluation of the program to demonstrate whether it reduces recidivism and also whether it reduces the use of other county services like emergency rooms and homeless shelters. Third, housing and family support. Research also shows that access to housing is essential in successfully reintegrating into the community. By reducing stress and providing a stable base from which to resume a free world life, it substantially increases the likelihood that a person returning home from prison or jail will be able to find and retain employment, stay drug-free, and refrain from committing further crimes. Additionally, a growing body of research indicates that individuals recently released from incarceration who have strong family connections have greater success in securing and retaining employment. Reuniting families can also yield benefits for partners and children of people returning from jail, such as increased family stability, enhanced emotional and financial supports, and improved educational outcomes for children. Based on that research, Vera is currently working on a pilot program with the New York City Housing Authority and other partners that waives the ban on public housing for some people returning from incarceration and allows them to reunite with their families. The program will be evaluated to determine whether it reduces homelessness and returns to prison or jail. Fourth, employment, job readiness, and education. As Vera knows from our work in the LA County Jail, employment is often the primary concern of people coming out of custody, and in fact, it was cited by 72% of the men we interviewed as their most important reentry priority. Meaningful employment can help individuals succeed in the community after release from incarceration because it refocuses their time and efforts on pro-social activities, making them less likely to engage in risky behaviors or interact with criminal associates, not to mention actually earning an income. Education is also strongly tied to employment prospects, financial stability, and quality of life, yet the majority of incarcerated people lack a high school diploma or its equivalent. And a recent RAND study shows that correctional education programs reduce recidivism. On average, individuals who participated in those programs were 43% less likely to recidivate than those who had not participated. To address these issues, Vera is currently leading the Pathways Project, a 5-year demonstration project in 3 states, New Jersey, Michigan, and North Carolina, that creates an education continuum that begins in prison and continues in the community after release until a student has actually earned an advanced degree or a professional certification. Efforts are underway to explore that project's replication here in California.
Ms. Tamas, I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm going to have to ask you to conclude as well.
Yes, of course, of course. There are some other, obviously it's very important to focus reentry efforts on juveniles as well, so there are a lot of efforts going on there. I do need to mention that all reentry services and programming must be evaluated. I know we're a research organization, and we care a lot about that, but I know you do as well as policymakers. You can't just adopt full programs from other places and expect the outcomes to be the same. It's critical to regularly analyze data, to measure outcomes, and to conduct cost-benefit analyses. You also need to make sure that there's fidelity to program elements and to have quality assurance in place to make that happen. To conclude, it's clear that what we've been doing, and I think you all recognize that here, over the past 30 years to improve public safety and reduce public costs has not worked. However, we now have the tools that have been shown to reduce crime, improve the health of both individuals and communities, and reduce the state's prison and jail population. At least 95% of inmates in America's jails and prisons ultimately will be released and returned to the community. It's in our collective best interests for the health and safety of all of our communities, as well as for the state's bottom line, to ensure that we do our best to follow where the research leads us. That is, to provide the treatment, services, and support that offenders need to become productive members of our society. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stamos. The presentation is very informative, and just as you were making your concluding statement, my first comment back to you was going to be, we have clearly been doing everything so completely backwards and wrong for so very long. And just as Assistant Sheriff had said earlier, recidivism is a new term that we can now use. We're also talking about rehabilitation, a word we could barely use a few years ago, and re-entry as well. So all fitting together, and the facts and figures you've shared are very important to us. I know a number of colleagues have questions. Senator Jackson has to leave shortly, so I'm going to ask her first, and then Senator Berryhill, and then Senator Mitchell.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentations. I think for most of us, what we heard is not startling. In fact, it makes a lot of good sense. I'd like to just, if I could ask you a question focusing in a particular area. Do you in LA County keep track of the number of veterans that come through the jail system? When someone in your intake, do you ask whether or not they're a veteran?
We do ask whether or not they're a veteran. Also in LA County, we partner with the VA administration. We're clustering our veterans, and the VA comes in and helps do program with us. They also have offered us free beds. So we've been working with the Veterans Administration to place some of our sentenced offenders and pretrial offenders in a VA program while under supervision. So a long answer to a short question, yes.
And I wonder, because there's been a suggestion that right at the intake level, it might even take place out in the field, that we know veterans tend to have unique well, they're not unique problems, but generated from unique circumstances that can probably best be addressed by the VA, or at least should be addressed by the VA. And I'm wondering, is this a discussion, not just after post-sentencing or what have you, but early on, if there's any effort to find out their veteran status, and then at that point in time, either take them directly to the VA or process them and then try to get services immediately for them, which may very well reduce the court process. We're trying to figure out how to unclog the courts, and certainly might also help address our jail population problem.
So much like my colleague spoke about InReach, the VA is doing InReach with us. If you're interested in the global numbers of veterans nationally, they're actually reducing nationally in the prison systems because the VA is trying to partner with large organizations.
And the other question, I think both of you, what you're talking about, I think most of us here would agree with you. We want to move forward. The question I have is, how do we go about doing that while we're still taking in people, processing them, incarcerating them, putting through the court system, and then ultimately into either jail or prison? In order to have the resources to do the rehabilitation and what have you, we have to have money. So do you have some suggestions for us on how we can reduce the money that's now just going exclusively for incarceration, so that we can sort of cut down, slow down the tap, if you will, of people going into the prisons, with just so much money available, and this is sort of the debate that we're having as a legislature with the governor. How much money do we put into corrections? How much do we put into rehabilitation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Sure. I mean, I think it's a difficult one because some of it is an investment now for a payoff later.
Right.
But what we usually say is that the biggest bang for your buck is in the pretrial population and the diversion idea. So if you can divert people out on the street away from the front door of the system, you're going to immediately save costs. You'll save booking, you'll save the police officer's time. So there are a lot of good programs that can be done. If you have sobering centers out in the community, detox centers where police can bring people who are publicly intoxicated, if you have mental health treatment facilities where police can bring someone whose obvious issue is a mental health disorder, instead of having to make the really difficult choice of, do I bring them to the hospital or to the jail? The hospital and the jail both, don't necessarily want that person. And there are examples of places that have mental health drop-off centers where they have medical staff trained, if the criminal issue is not the primary one. And then if people are going to come in the front door, doing the risk and needs assessment to determine whether they need to be held in custody during the pretrial period or not. And we've found, in many jurisdictions, there are a lot of people who spend even just a few days in the system at the front end who probably don't need to be there at all. And if that assessment had been done sooner, they would have been, out the door already. So there are some places, like in Orange County, they have people who sit inside the jail 24 hours a day conducting risk assessments and making release decisions. So there are real ways to get a lot of people out the door very quickly. There's other things that can be done with court processing, and then the whole way along the line.
So it sounds like what you're suggesting, things that we could be doing now that we don't have to fight over $1, or we're going to put it in incarceration or in treatment, that actually there are systems that we could be adopting now that would not require us to put additional funds in order to adjust from the other. I mean, we're having this discussion now about how many beds we need to have in prison, or how we expand our jails, because we're now realigning these people in our jails. What I hear you saying is that actually if we were more proactive up front with some of these risk assessment and other programs that exist, and I think Mr. DeVore made the same comment, that we could really start lowering our prison population sooner rather than later. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I would definitely agree. I don't know if you want to add.
This is all so incredibly complicated. When you start to think about who's coming back in the door, they're coming back in the door because of drug treatment needs, because of criminogenic relationships. In other words, we program them in the jail or the prison, and we move them back to a crime-infested community. Things like employment. You think about Delancey Street in San Francisco, or Homeboys Industries, where we actually have an agreement with Caltrans, with state corrections, where parolees work cleaning up the roadways. Begin to think about the barriers to successful reentry, employment, ban-the-box kind of concepts, safe housing, right? Then let's really talk about what's flowing into the prison. People not getting their high school diplomas, children of incarcerated people. So it's not there's no one simple elixir, this stuff is hard. But I think employment, safe housing, drug treatment when they get out, I think is also important.
Thank you, Senators. Senator Berryhill, Senator Mitchell, followed by Senator Monning.
Great, thank you. And again, I too want to thank you both for coming here today. Very informative. So thank you for that. You mentioned that the Latinos and the blacks had a fourth of a chance of being incarcerated, or whatever those numbers were. Do we have the numbers on Caucasians and what their likelihood of being incarcerated are? Just curious.
I don't. No, I can get that for you if you'd like.
Not the end of the world.
It's about a third and a third in the state prison system, in LA County system. Almost half are Hispanic.
Yeah, in California with the realignment, and I was in on a lot of these discussions when we, and the argument was that we were going to save about $2 billion by putting these folks down to the locals. The problem that we've had is that once we get down there, this money hasn't followed them, and we've made the argument it should, because what happens, once it gets down to the locals, we don't have these rehab programs because that money just hasn't followed them down there. And what ends up happening is they end up getting released because we can't hold them, and the recidivism comes, and they end up right back in prison. Just your thoughts on that money, what your thoughts are on that money following these guys down to the locals to help our guys out.
Sure.
Do
So,
you think it's a good idea?
sure. I mean, in the world of reentry, and in best practices supported by research, it is better to have people at the local community level. If they're going to be incarcerated somewhere, starting with that premise, it's better to be at the local community because they're closer to family, they're closer to support networks, they're also closer to community service providers who could start doing in-reach, and start making connections with people while they're in custody. So in general, it is better to have people at the community level. But I also, and I'm not an expert on following where the money flows, but my understanding is that I would agree with you that the money has not seemed to closely track, or follow the people who have been sent down to the counties, and that service providers in the community had to close, so many of their beds and had to reduce all of their staffs when they lost CDCR funding before or right around realignment, and that has not built back up. So we are at this sort of midpoint where there are not enough services currently being funded at the county level, but they're no longer, but the people are there. So I think that there has to be some catch-up that happens. But I think the providers are ready if they can get the resources, and I think they're, trying their best to provide the resources that they do have.
Would you agree that, obviously there's a certain portion of these folks going through the system that are ready to be rehabbed and can be rehabbed. Would you agree that there's also a portion of these folks, just the way they were brought up and everything else, they really have no chance of being rehabbed and probably shouldn't be released? And if that's the case, who are the best people in a position to make those decisions? Who should be and who just shouldn't be?
Sure, and that's exactly the point that I was trying to get at. That we know that in a system of, whether in LA it's 19,000 people or in another county, where it's only 500 people, no county has the resources to provide services to everyone who comes in the door. And our point is that you shouldn't. That there are people who are at low risk of reoffending who you will actually make worse by giving them too much intervention. Because you're going to interfere with whatever's already making them low risk to begin with. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are very high risk who need such intense services for such a long amount of time and are not, open to services, that they're also not a good place to put your resources. So the ideal is to find this group in the middle who are medium to high risk of reoffending and who are there long enough for you to actually serve. And the people to make that decision is whoever you have conducting an objective risk assessment, that it's not someone making a gut decision, when they sit down and talk to someone that, this woman, Karen, she seems like she needs services, that's not the way to do it, that there are scientific tools, instruments that are now available that if a person's trained to administer them can actually conduct, and that will tell you what that person's risk of reoffending is. And if it's medium to high risk, that's the person to target.
Yeah, it would seem to me that you would almost need somebody that has been there and seen the behavior before they could make a good assessment. But
There are specific, and I can share with you what the actual assessments look like, but they're really focused on specific factors that have been proven to be connected to someone's risk of reoffending. So once you actually, look at that information, you realize that it is actually not all that difficult to do if you have that instrument in front of you and if you're trained in how to do it.
Okay, thank you.
They work a little bit like when you're going for a life insurance policy, right? They ask you a series of questions and there's a point and wait system. It does the same thing. What's your age at first arrest? How many drug convictions, all of that. It's an actuarial. It's not perfect, but that's kind of how the tools work.
Yeah, when I go to my insurance company and tell them I've had a heart transplant, I'm immediately in the...
Same concept.
Thank you, Senator Berryhill. I guess the short answer to the Senator's question, which you've really re-emphasized appropriately today is evidence-based risk assessment.
Right, that's right.
I'm going to follow up on a question on that later, but first Senator Mitchell, then Senator Monning, and Senator Bell.